To understand Showmax collapsing in 2026, we have to go back more than 40 years. And we are going way back before streaming, before Netflix, before even satellite TV in Africa. Now the story starts with a South African media company called Naspers. Naspers was founded in 1915 as a newspaper publisher, just newspapers. For decades, that was their business. But in the early 1980s, something interesting happened. A young man named Koos Becker, he was studying at Columbia University in New York. While there, he wrote a university paper about something that sounded crazy at the time, paying for television. At that time, television was free almost everywhere. Governments ran it. In South Africa, the dominant broadcaster was SABC. Koos Becker believed that people would eventually pay a monthly subscription if the content was good enough. You know, things like movies, sports, and exclusive shows. He pitched the idea to Naspers, and they took the gamble. In 1986, they launched M-Net. That was in October 1st, 1986. It became Africa's first pay TV service, and it struggled badly at first. Imagine telling people in the 1980s that they must pay every month just to watch TV. Most people thought it was ridiculous. For years, M-Net lost money, but Naspers stayed patient. They offered movies you couldn't get anywhere else. And they also offered sports. Slowly, people started buying decoders and paying monthly subscriptions. Then came the real revolution. October 18th, 1995, DSTV launched. Now, DSTV became the first direct-to-home digital satellite TV service outside the United States. And that changed everything. Instead of a few channels with fuzzy signals, suddenly households across Africa, they could access dozens of channels with clear reception. MultiChoice, which operated the service, it expanded rapidly. Namibia, Botswana, Kenya, Nigeria, Uganda, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. Across the continent, the same story was repeating itself. Local TV stations, they had very little content. Then suddenly people could watch EPL football, Hollywood movies, international news, and African entertainment all from one decoder. By the 2010s, DSTV had millions of subscribers. SuperSport became the home of football in Africa. Watching Premier League in a lounge or just at home, it became part of a daily culture. Now, DSTV wasn't just a TV service anymore. It became a status symbol. If your house had DSTV, it meant you're doing well. By 2020, MultiChoice had more than 20 million subscribers across Africa. They dominated the continent. But when things looked secure, another revolution began. And this revolution, believe it or not, it came from streaming. Between 2010 and 2016, the global television industry started shifting away from traditional cable and satellite. People no longer wanted to wait for scheduled programs. They wanted to watch whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. Netflix led this change. In 2013, Netflix released its first major original show, House of Cards. Instead of releasing one episode per week like traditional television, they released the entire season at once. People binge-watched. That behavior, it completely changed how audiences consumed entertainment. By 2015, Netflix had more than 65 million subscribers globally. And then another giant entered the fight. Amazon. Amazon Prime Video, it began aggressively investing in original content as well. By the mid-2010s, streaming had become a real threat to traditional television, and MultiChoice could see the danger coming. If Africans started abandoning satellite television, you know the way the Americans were abandoning cable, their entire business model could collapse. So they decided to build their own streaming platform. On August 19th, 2015, MultiChoice launched Showmax. It was the answer to Netflix. Their strategy was simple. Netflix, it had global shows. Showmax would focus on African stories. I'm talking about Kenyan shows, Nigerian shows, South African shows, and it worked for a while. By the mid-2000s, MultiChoice had built a powerful television empire across Africa. DSTV had millions of subscribers, SuperSport controlled premium football, and movies and entertainment channels. They filled the packages. But behind the scenes, there was a massive problem: piracy. Between 2005 and 2015, piracy exploded across Africa's television and film industry. And it happened in several ways. The first was physical piracy. In cities like Nairobi, Lagos, and Kampala, entire markets sold bootleg DVDs, Hollywood movies, African films, even TV series. They were duplicated and sold cheaply. In Kenya, River Road became famous for it. By 2015, Kenya's film and television industry was losing about $27 million every year because of illegal duplication. Music piracy added another $18 million in losses annually. But DVDs were only one part of the problem. The second form was signal theft. People discovered ways to illegally access pay TV signals without paying subscriptions. This became extremely common with DSTV. One decoder would be installed in a bar or a house, and then cables would run into multiple homes. Entire neighborhoods, they could watch premium football through one illegal setup. Another method was called card sharing. A single subscription card would be shared through the internet networks, allowing multiple people to access the signal at the same time. For MultiChoice, this was a nightmare. The company had millions of official subscribers, but millions more were watching illegally. By the early 2010s, industry estimates suggested that across parts of Africa and the Middle East, only about 20% of households that watched pay television were actually paying for it. That means roughly 80% of viewers, they were accessing content illegally. The financial damage was massive. Some estimates placed the annual losses to African television companies at over $2.5 billion. Even in individual countries, the numbers were alarming. Uganda's communications regulator later estimated that illegal signal sharing was costing television operators about $740 million annually. MultiChoice tried to fight back. They invested heavily in encryption technology through a security company called Adeto. They conducted raids on pirate operators, but piracy kept evolving faster than enforcement. At the same time, another change was happening. Internet access was slowly improving. Mobile data networks, they were expanding. 3G and 4G connections, they were spreading across African cities. This created a new possibility. Instead of fighting piracy only with technology and enforcement, companies could compete with convenience. If people could watch content easily and cheaply on their phones, they might stop relying on pirate networks. That idea became one of the reasons that Showmax was created. Now, Showmax was designed to remove the biggest barriers of traditional pay television. Because here you didn't need a satellite dish or a decoder, you only needed internet. And that made it possible to reach a completely new audience. The young people watching on smartphones, the students watching on laptops, and urban viewers who preferred mobile entertainment. So you can clearly see that for MultiChoice, Showmax was a survival strategy. But the global streaming war was about to become much more expensive than they expected. Now, when Showmax launched in August 2015, it entered a battlefield that was already extremely competitive. Netflix had already started expanding internationally, and Amazon Prime Video was building its own streaming library. These companies had something that African broadcasters did not. More than 1,300 hours of African original productions were commissioned. The new shows, they were announced across multiple countries. We had Nigeria, we had Kenya, and we had South Africa. Subscriber growth, it accelerated again. At one point, Showmax was reportedly growing faster than Netflix in some African markets, but the financial pressure never disappeared. Behind the scenes, the cost of running the platform continued rising. Technology infrastructure alone cost billions of rand, and the competition was becoming brutal. Because Showmax was not just competing with Netflix anymore, it was competing with the entire internet. By the mid-2020s, the entertainment landscape had completely changed. Streaming platforms were everywhere. Netflix continued expanding across Africa. Amazon Prime Video, it entered more markets. Disney Plus began pushing global franchises. But those companies were not even the biggest problem. The real competition was free content. I'm talking about YouTube, TikTok. You know, social media platforms where people could watch entertainment without paying monthly subscriptions. For many young viewers in Africa, the choice became simple. Why pay for a streaming service when you can watch hours of content for free on your phone? At the same time, mobile data costs, they remained a challenge in many countries. Streaming long shows, it required large data bundles. Short-form videos on platforms like TikTok, they used much less data and delivered instant entertainment. This created a serious problem for subscription platforms. Even when people liked the content, they often cancelled subscriptions during difficult economic periods. MultiChoice started seeing the pressure in its numbers. Between 2023 and 2025, the company lost about 3.7 million subscribers across its platforms. At the same time, Showmax losses, they were increasing. By 2025, the streaming division was losing nearly 4.9 billion rand annually, an increase of almost 88% compared to earlier years. Total spending on the platform had already crossed 20 billion rand. Despite all the investment, revenue from Showmax remained far lower than expected. This forced major strategic decisions inside the company. Meanwhile, another powerful player was entering the story. The French media giant, Canal Plus. Now, Canal Plus had been quietly buying shares in MultiChoice for years. In March 2024, they made a major move. They offered about $2 billion to acquire the company. Regulators reviewed the deal throughout 2025, and South Africa's Competition Commission approved it in May 2025. The Competition Tribunal cleared it in July 2025. By September 19, 2025, Canal Plus completed the takeover. The company eventually controlled more than 46% of MultiChoice, effectively becoming the dominant force behind the business. Once the new ownership structure was in place, executives began reviewing every major division, and one platform stood out immediately: Showmax. Despite years of investment, massive partnerships and technological upgrades, the platform was still losing enormous amounts of money. For Canal Plus, the conclusion was clear. Streaming was not the most profitable path for their African strategy. Their strength remained traditional pay television, the DSTV, SuperSport, and satellite broadcasting. And that decision, it would lead to the final chapter of the Showmax story, the shutdown in March 2026. By early 2026, the situation inside MultiChoice had become impossible to ignore. Showmax had consumed enormous resources. We are talking about years of development, billions of rand in technology investment, and hundreds of original productions. But financially, it was still bleeding. By the 2025 financial year, Showmax losses had reached about 4.9 billion rand annually. That represented an 88% increase in trading losses compared to earlier years. Total investment in the platform had already crossed 20 billion rand when you include technology infrastructure, content spending, marketing, and international partnerships. And the revenue simply could not catch up. The platform was earning somewhere between 800 million and 1 billion rand per year. That gap made the business extremely difficult to justify. Then the Canal Plus takeover changed everything. The French media giant had just completed its strategic acquisition of MultiChoice in September 2025 after a long regulatory process. Once inside the company, Canal Plus began evaluating the entire operation. They looked at satellite broadcasting, they looked at sports rights, they looked at African content production, and they looked at Showmax. The conclusion was blunt. Streaming in Africa was far more expensive than expected and far less profitable than satellite television. Africa still had major infrastructure limitations. Internet penetration was improving, but it was not universal. Mobile data remained expensive in many markets. Many households still relied on satellite TV rather than streaming platforms. So Canal Plus made a strategic decision. Instead of trying to win the streaming war, they would focus on what they already controlled extremely well: pay television, DSTV, SuperSport, and satellite distribution across dozens of African countries. Then came the announcement. Between March 4th and March 5th, 2026, MultiChoice executives informed partners, producers, and industry stakeholders that Showmax will be shut down. Emails were sent to some producers, and internal briefings were held with production companies. The official explanation was simple. The platform had generated substantial annual losses that were no longer sustainable. For thousands of people in the African film industry, the news landed like a shockwave. And this was because Showmax had become one of the biggest investors in African storytelling. Since its launch in 2015, the platform had funded productions across multiple countries: Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. Production houses built entire business models around those commissions. Kenyan companies like Film Matter and Spellcasting Pictures, they had produced major series for the platform. Shows like Single Kiasi and The Real Housewives of Nairobi, they helped build local audiences for premium African television. Actors like Sarah Hassan, they gained international visibility through series such as Crime and Justice. Across the continent, Showmax Originals created opportunities for hundreds of actors, directors, cinematographers, and writers. When the shutdown announcement came, many of those pipelines suddenly disappeared. Industry estimates suggested that over 1,000 freelancers in Kenya alone, they depended on projects connected to the platform. That included editors, camera operators, sound engineers, makeup artists, and production assistants. Across Africa, the number was even higher. Projects that were already filming, they were allowed to finish. But many productions still in development, they were quietly cancelled. Some scripts were shelved, some contracts simply expired without renewal, and producers who had been negotiating new seasons, they suddenly had nowhere to take their projects. But the content itself did not disappear. And this is because the intellectual property behind Showmax still belongs to MultiChoice and its partners. Most African original shows, they remained under company ownership. That meant they could be redistributed through other platforms. Many titles were expected to move into DSTV Stream, which is the company's hybrid streaming and satellite service. Others would return to traditional television channels like M-Net, Mzansi Magic, and Africa Magic. Sports content would remain firmly under SuperSport, which continued to be one of the most valuable parts of the entire MultiChoice empire. Some international content licenses simply expired. Hollywood studios like Warner Bros. Or Sony, they would take their shows back once exclusivity agreements ended. But African originals, they would continue existing within the MultiChoice catalog. Anyway, still, the shutdown marked the end of a major chapter. Showmax, it had been Africa's most ambitious attempt to build a homegrown streaming platform capable of competing with global giants. And for a moment, it looked possible. Anyway, that's the breakdown on Showmax. This is just Catalina, and I'll see you guys in the next system breakdown.